What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up, Danny? What's up, my friend?
Chilling, man, as per usual. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty well. I am recovering from the first wedding I've been to. Well, it's not the first wedding I've been to since COVID. It is the first larger wedding I've been to since COVID. I've actually been to two other ones this summer, or not this summer, over the past year. But it was a lot of fun. It was nice to finally be around like in a normal event.
Like normal settings, yeah.
Like a normal setting. Like, yeah, people had masks on and stuff, but most people didn't actually have masks on.
Well, once you start drinking, then the stuff like that
the
starts
mask.
coming up.
It was so funny because it was a barn wedding, and when we first went in, people had masks within like an hour. Nobody was wearing it, but the people who worked at the venue, like, they were selectively enforcing the rules. They were like, "You put your mask on," and like the next person would not have a mask on at all. Well, it was just chaos.
I don't blame them. I bet some fucking drunk assholes. Like, it must be really hard to like corral people and make them wear masks while they're walking around.
There's no way you can do that.
No,
I mean, at this point, most people are at least who are at risk are vaccinated. So
yeah. That was just going to say that.
Big deal?
I actually just recently got vaccinated, and I'm recovering from that. I had some side effect symptoms, but it was totally worth it, in my opinion.
Well, this wedding I went to, you had to be tested. So most people showed their test results or their vaccination, whatever, card or passport or whatever the hell it is.
Vaccination passport.
At the venue. So, I mean, there was a pretty high chance that no one there had it. And even if we had masks on at that point, like, everyone is like, on top, like everyone's kind of on top of each other, so masks aren't going to do shit. But whatever, it was a fun time, and I guess it's cool that you're vaccinated. I haven't got my vaccination yet. I probably will eventually get it when it becomes not out of fear of not getting vaccinated. It's more so just being lazy. So once the inconvenience of like booking an appointment to get vaccinated is not as inconvenient as like not having the vaccination, that's probably when I'll do it. When
So there's like a Venn diagram there,
yeah,
right?
just out of convenience. Also, my girlfriend's forcing me to do it, so I have to pretty much listen to her. Yeah. But whatever.
Well, the 5G that you get afterwards is fucking awesome. Like I get the internet really fast now, so it's worth it. You should think about it.
Wait, what?
I'm joking.
Oh, 5G.
They're inserting 5G chips into you.
Oh, okay. So is that the word on the street that they're inserting 5G chips?
I don't know. I'm just fucking around.
I'll take them. Does it make you more powerful?
No, but you get great cell service.
Well, we'll see. All right, let's talk about what we are
supposed to talk
about today. So have you ever heard of the term government by assassination?
Hell yeah, I think we actually might have touched on it very briefly in the last episode.
So this term comes from a book written in the 1930s by Hugh Byas, who was a British journalist covering Japan. And this book is about Japanese politics in the 1920s and 30s. And it's essentially about the rise of very hardcore nationalist groups. And these nationalist groups became very violent, aka they would engage in political assassinations. And they would do this frequently. It wasn't like a one-time thing. For example, and this is the most notable one, the Prime Minister of Japan was murdered by a group of junior officers in their very early 20s in 1932. And this is just one of many political murders. So there are too many assassinations pre-World War II Japan to even really track or to justify. It's happening at such a frequent rate in the 1920s and 1930s that we wouldn't be able to cover them all in one episode. It would just be impossible. Right. Even in Dan Carlin's epic, he has like a 5-part series on the rise and more so in the Pacific War in World War II. he doesn't even really touch on that much on these assassinations, but there's just a lot of them. But the one on May 15th in 1932, which is ironically my birthday, I wasn't born in 1932, but May 15th is my birthday, is essentially the moment the Japanese empire is no longer ran by a civilian government. It marks the beginning of Japan diving into military dictatorship. And let's give this some historical context. Let's pull this back a little bit, because this is part of a series we've been doing on Japan, the rise of the nation state of Japan and the rise of kind of a national consciousness in Japan. So, what are some of the things that we've talked about in the past two episodes that kind of correlate to this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think we've been asking a lot of these questions, especially 2 episodes ago, about like, do we think that nationalism was a uniquely European phenomenon, or that it spread throughout the rest of the world, and specifically Japan, via diffusion? We tried to find an answer to that. I don't think we came up with anything definitive, though. But we looked at the Warring States period in Japan, or the Sengoku Jidai, which was from like 1400 to 1600. And we took a look at the proto-nationalism that was being developed at the time under the 3 great unifiers of Japan. So that was Nobunaga Oda, Hideyoshi Toyotomi, and Ieyasu Tokugawa. So we learned a little bit about Nobunaga. He was a forward-thinking leader. He employed, modern technology of the day from the Portuguese to make his small, tiny little clan become the dominant force in Japan. His achievements basically extended beyond that of the military, though, because he also established a central government and opened up free trade policies domestically and abroad. And generally, he formed a pretty open relationship with the world. Later, we find out that Hideyoshi takes up the mantle of Nobunaga after, go figure, Nobunaga gets assassinated. So that fits in really well with what you were saying. And Hideyoshi was... Go ahead.
Assassinations throughout Japanese history are incredibly Japanese. It's almost like a very clear part of, at the very least, like Japanese history pre-World War II.
It's kind of like if
it's
there was like a historical
theme.
If there was like a Japanese historical tech support, right? Somebody calls up and like, hey, my shogun isn't really working very well. And the Japanese historical tech support goes, well, have you tried assassinating him yet?
Is that a joke you just came up with?
I just pulled that out of my ass. So Hideyoshi takes up after he gets off the phone with tech support. And he's actually an interesting dude. He is a rags to riches kind of story. He comes up in the Nobunaga administration from basically a peasant to becoming like a top military commander, and his policies furthered a lot of what Nobunaga was doing, but he also established a lot of like strict rules against like freedom of motion and movement within the country. He also disarmed the peasantry, so he came and took all their guns away, and he set up systems of taxation. He also set up a kind of proto-imperialist campaign in Korea, which Nobunaga wanted to do. He wanted to basically invade because they were trying to act like China. And basically they did okay in the beginning, but ultimately they got their ass kicked by the Korean Navy. And finally, the last of the 3 unifiers was Tokugawa. He basically ushered in a 200-year stretch of peace in Japan. It was full of art and culture and this weird quasi-nationalism centered around a strong imperial government, and also around the like general like nostalgia for like going back to the good old days in Japan. When samurais and rice farmers ruled. Very make Japan great again kind of moment in Japanese history, and at the same time, though, Tokugawa definitely closes off Japan to the rest of the world, so he reversed what his predecessors were doing. And he also let the Japanese identity grow independent of outside influence. But this kind of comes at a cost later in the face of like stronger foreign powers. And, you know, like I said, we didn't really come to any concrete conclusions about how nationalism grew in Japan, but we did get a chance to really look at the subtle nuances of the subject by kind of looking at the dynamic and changing nature of the Warring States period, the Sengoku Jidai. Later, we took a look at China in the late 19th century as a setup for Japan and how it transformed itself in the faces of stronger foreign powers. And, you know, we learned a little bit about how the Qing Empire fell to opium trade and the proto-gunboat diplomacy of the British. And then we did a deeper dive into U.S.-Japanese relationships prior to 1853, which we discovered that the U.S. and Japan, you know, they had limited contact, but it wasn't totally unheard of, and it was mostly in the whaling industries, and there's a lot of really interesting, fun stories about trying to return shipwrecked sailors and people getting their heads chopped off, and a lot of fun, little interesting tidbits that I never knew.
A lot of interesting confrontations and awkward moments between U.S. naval officers and Japanese samurai.
Yeah. Definitely listen to that.
That led to very kind of rabble-rising in the U.S. where they were like, they can't disrespect someone in uniform. How dare they?
Yeah.
Next time we go over to Japan, we're going to fucking force them to open up their borders.
Right. And that's kind of where the next bits of that, you know, episode goes, which is...
It's interesting, though, because it's something that contributed to... in the quest to open up Japan's borders, it actually leads to a rise in U.S. nationalism.
Right.
You know, this sense of U.S. national consciousness.
Mm-hmm. And the later expeditions of the U.S. to Japan end up coming up short with sometimes humiliating endings. But the U.S.'s desire to form these trading relationships, as well as just using Japan as a strategic refueling point in East Asia, basically keeps it in the struggle. And that's when they send over Commodore Perry, who is famous for, you know, rolling up deep in his black gunships. And, you know, he got the okay to open up Japan, even by force if necessary. Fun fact about him, he didn't even want to go in the first place. But if he was going to go, he wasn't going to come back empty-handed like his predecessors. So he was an interesting dude. He lied his way to success.
He wanted to go to the Mediterranean, right? Like he thought it was more worthwhile to
He thought facing the Ottomans was a better idea.
Yeah, he was more of like an Ottoman hawk, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
he was an interesting dude.
He ultimately felt that his talents were being wasted, but at the same time, there's this sense of with Perry that that the guys who previously went there fucked up so bad that he kind of had to go solve their problems.
Right, he had to go clean up after them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and how he did it was like just by straight up lying. So when he first got over there, he was doing like fake military drills in the island kingdom of Ryukyu, which is separate from the Empire of Japan at the time. And like lying to them about how many Marines he had at his disposal to invade them with, and was like, "Oh yeah, go tell your friends in Edo, you know, I've got like 3,000 Marines ready to storm the beaches." He also got to Edo, or modern day Tokyo Bay, and basically started firing off a bunch of blanks, using small support vessels to harass Japanese Coast Guard ships. And then he bluffed about the size of the U.S. Navy, and he claimed that he would come back to crush them with over 200 ships. Now, I always found that fact kind of funny because the U.S. Navy didn't have close to that many ships at the time. I mean, even today, I looked this up before the show. Today, we only have 490 total ships. And one, not all of them are blue water ships, meaning that they can cross the Pacific. And two, not all of them are active. So really, saying that you're going to bring over 200 ships to wreck Japan was like the biggest lie that you could tell in 1853.
Like, in 1853, the U.S. probably had like 15 ships.
Yeah.
I don't know what the exact number is, but it's
No,
it's
it was
such an
more than 15,
exaggeration.
but it was definitely less than 200.
It was definitely
You know?
less than 200 ships.
Yeah, yeah. It was just funny because like he would run around there and just lie and like poker face his way to the truth, and honestly he also caught a break too because like the current emperor there died of like sickness or some shit, and that changing of the guard made it kind of easy to manipulate them, but it was still kind of ballsy. But yeah, that's basically where we start seeing Japan open up. He was super successful. Perry was in opening up Japan, and he aided in their economic, cultural, and governmental, and even military transformation. And this is like the Meiji Restoration period. I'll stop right there though.
Yeah. So the Imperial Meiji government that was founded by so this government that's founded after the Tokugawa shogun, it's founded by a group of low-ranking samurai who had already been disgruntled with the Tokugawa shogun. So they were known as shishi. So that translates to like warriors of high aspiration. Mm-hmm. And one of the main reasons why they were so disgruntled with the Tokugawa shogun was probably their own economic status. But after 1853, when the U.S. forces Japan to open up their borders, there becomes this new narrative. So it ties back to the visit from the black ships. So the shogun failed to prevent the country from being influenced by foreign barbarians. Mm-hmm. The shogun sold out Japan to the West. So if you look at, for example, just type in Japanese, if you're listening to this, type in Japanese portrait of Matthew Perry. And the picture that they draw of him, it looks ridiculous. Like he has like a huge nose. It looks like an anti-Semitic picture that like Nazi Germany did of Jews.
Okay, so
that's
this
what
is
it looks
going to
like.
be. This is yes, this is relevant. What he looks like is a word called an oni, and I want to talk about this later. So just put a pin in that. Yes, I just saw exactly what this means. Yeah.
But they saw foreigners as kind of gross because think about it, when you're traveling to Japan, it's not like a 2-day trip. It's a trip that takes several months, and the ships are lice infested. You're coming out hairy, unshaved. And they're probably just like gross. So there was this narrative that the shogun opened up the doors to the West, and they opened up the floodgates for all these foreign barbarians, because now you see a bunch of profiteers and people trying to come into Japan since the borders are open to the trade. Therefore, these shishi samurai, what they plan on doing is they divert their loyalty from the shogun back to the emperor, who was at this time powerless. Like the Emperor of Japan was a ceremonial / religious role. And to go back to like the proto-nationalism in the 18th century, a lot of these shishi were influenced by Amaterasu Nobunaga. And you had mentioned the Make Japan Great Again movement. Right. Well, he's kind of like this architect of it. He was the movement was translates to what is Japan. And what it ultimately like the people who subscribed to this was that Japan in antiquity was perfect. It was a utopia, and that foreign influence ultimately contaminated Japan. So what the scholars of these movements did is that they would go through through ancient Japanese texts and try to purge what they thought was foreign. And it sounds pretty silly because, as you know, probably a lot of people know who are listening, a lot of Japanese culture comes from, like the Tang dynasty, like the dynasties of China, from 2,000, 1,500 years ago.
Right, from their neighbors.
Trying to separate that, obviously Japan develops its own uniqueness at that time period, but the beginning states in the writings and they were using Chinese characters.
Right. I mean, they borrow very heavily. That's an undisputed fact, and I think that's kind of what's interesting about Japan in general, because depending on when you start looking at the history of Japan, you might say, oh, well, Japan was this like, secluded hermit nation that, came up all by itself and like, whatever. And that's not exactly true, right? But it's not entirely true by itself that they were totally, influenced by outside powers either. It's kind of both. And it flip-flops a lot.
It's like that nurture versus nurture argument.
Yep.
It's very, very, I think it applies to nations as well as to national consciousness.
Yeah.
You don't really know why someone is the way they are. It's always a combination of, parenting as well as your genetics. There's always like a combination of the two. Like there's some people who can be born in just the shittiest circumstance whatsoever, abusive parents, bad neighborhoods, just every disadvantage that you could possibly have, but they succeed for some reason or another, and it's because of something that just kind of drives them and makes them succeed. Other people, they're just, they're born with a lot of advantages, or they just have great parents, or a kind of a great structure at home, and it leads to their success. There's different reasons why people end up the way they are, and mostly it's impossible to really fully understand what is more important, or what ultimately leads to the development
factor.
So what is the true factor? And I think that applies to more things than we like to admit. Everyone likes to credit one thing, like, it's the way his parents taught him to read, or whatever. I'm gonna digress too far, but I think this point is, this applies to nations, I think national conscious movements, things like that. Now, to make things short with these the Shishi movement, they ultimately are the ones that lead a revolution against the shogun, and they succeed. But here's the caveat. The new leaders of this movement, instead of holding on to their previous isolationist policies, they quickly come to the realization that if they don't modernize, they're going to end up like China. China, at this time, is being carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey. Everyone has a piece of China at this time.
Yep.
The British, Germans,
the Portuguese,
the French. It is a playground for European powers, like an absolute playground. So they're looking on the other side, and they're saying, well, we don't really want that to happen to us, do we
fuck
now?
That.
We don't really want this country to be completely looted by foreigners. So they come to the realization that they need to ultimately cooperate with the West. So they start to rapidly adopt Western-style reforms, political systems, weapons, all that stuff. And the rest is history. Japan embarks on this rapid modernization process that we all know. It takes them about 40 years to go from feudal society to a modern country. The year that the Meiji Restoration ultimately, like the official start date, is 1868. And during this period, what's interesting is that there's like a famous saying that if we combined, and I forget who this is credited to, but it's something along the lines of, if we combine Western technology with Japanese spirit, then we will be unstoppable as a nation. Well, what Japan does is they start to engage in their own version of imperialism. So they annex Korea first, because Korea is kind of like seen as the dagger to Japan. It literally kind of points into Japan mainland. So
a Prussian general or whatever, like one of Wilhelm's top commander guys that he sent over to Japan by request from the Japanese to like train them up on military shit. He was the one that actually pointed that out. He looked at a map and he was like, oh, Korea, like that's geopolitically like disadvantageous for you if you don't own that, because that's like spring off point for anyone, the Russians, you know, the Chinese, whoever else, you know, like if they have control of that mainland, they're just, it's like exactly what you said. It's a dagger pointing at the Japanese gut.
Yeah, it's 100% a huge foreign policy liability if you have that open, or still as a protectorate state of Qing China, which is falling apart at this time. Like Qing China, at the same time that Japan is going through this modernization process, the Qing dynasty is a very corrupt, splintered political institution that
opium junkies
that is just completely unraveling. And by 1911, there is no more Qing dynasty. China falls into the hands of many warlords that, you know, they're not a unified state until Chiang Kai-shek goes on his, you know, great unifying campaign, and then, you know, they're ultimately invaded by Japan, and that kind of springboards the communist movement that's been dormant in there. But we actually have an episode on the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, so that's like, we did that about 5 episodes ago or so. If you want more info on that. However, I think I pulled this quote from a French diplomat to Japan, and I think it's I like this quote. It will be sufficient to say that, let me just start over. It will be sufficient to say that since 1852, I think he means 53, when the U.S. enforced its demands for open doors down to our own day, Japan has undergone such transformations and so effectively shaken off its old Chinese civilization and adopting the European mechanism that it became military and economic, but above all, a military factor. A factor that cannot be ignored, must be reckoned with. The foundation of the Japanese character being very warlike and martial was instrumental for a long time in turning the nation to things appertaining to fighting. Since the earliest ages, the education of young Japanese of good family has chiefly been of a military kind. So, observing the martial qualities that Japan is beginning to develop. And I think this is kind of a complicated concept, and I think we may be a little bit over our heads in going into this, but there is this popular idea among the would-be national leaders during the Meiji Restoration that was known as the subjective state of mind. Meaning,
it's a moral philosophy, right?
A moral philosophy, meaning that the motive for doing something outweighs the actual consequence of someone's actions. So,
right.
You know, under this kind of moral handbook, you can kill somebody. However, if it's for the right reasons, you know, if you're committing murder because of your sense of patriotism or your sense of loyalty to the emperor, then it becomes justified. So essentially, this kind of ideology is setting the stage of a lot of the political turbulence that Japan is going to go through over the following decades. This moral belief that your actions can be justified by your intentions.
Right.
So a paper that I read was kind of highlights a lot of this, is by a professor at the University of Jerusalem, Danny Orbach. And according to this ideology of subjectivism, the state of mind of an ideal shishi had to include several components, and these are the components that were included in this type of philosophy. Spontaneity. The shishi was expected to act violently when feeling righteous indignation, because spontaneous outbursts of emotion showed the purity of one's feelings and intentions. Then there's sincerity, So madness and folly were positive markers, denoting an individual's sincere readiness to sacrifice his life. In 1860, when a contingent of shishi from the Tosa domain made their way to Edo, some of them wanted to disembowel themselves to push the others to greater heroism, and were only dissuaded with great difficulty. Such a movement made no personal sense. It was only an extreme way to display a sincere readiness to die for a cause. And then pure motives. A shishi may be mistaken, may do harm, and even fight on the wrong side, yet he had to have proper motives. A pure-hearted shishi was not only spontaneous and sincere, he also had to intend to fight for the realm and the emperor, and not for private gain, or for any particular group in society. So
it's interesting.
It's trying to think of the best way to explain this, or the best way to highlight this. Well, I guess before jumping into that, we should discuss if this was something that was like, where did this kind of ideology come from?
Subjectivism?
Where does subjectivism come from? Was this something that was imported into Japan, or was it something that was uniquely stemmed, or was uniquely rooted over the past centuries of Japan's isolation, and even previous to that, their feudal warring states periods?
What do you think?
Was it something uniquely Japanese, or was it European? I think that this is something that is more Japanese than European. When we spoke about Bushido being, because we did an episode called Myth of the Samurai, and what we were talking about is that Bushido was a modern construct, or an invented construct to ultimately legitimize the state. And it was Bushido was basically European chivalry or romanticism manifested in Japanese form. So books like Soul of Japan that were used as state propaganda, they weren't really published until the 20th century. Soul of Japan actually being published in the year 1899, first in America. So it was written in English and then it was translated to Japanese. But these, Bushido as a movement was something that was more so a modern construct than actual code that samurai lived in, that samurai lived by. And I think that this concept of subjectivism was more so developed as a school of thought during the Tokugawa period because of a lot of the very unique economic and political circumstances that were going on during this time. Because we're talking about, as a country, it's very, there's natural disasters. You have there's a lot of like economic shuffling with like there not being as many wars and things like that. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I agree with you. I think subjectivism, at least, it might have been reintroduced from outside, when the Meiji Restoration kicked off. But to be honest, I think subjectivism was definitely already a part of the national consciousness and the national identity for hundreds, if not thousands of years. You could probably trace this to the medieval period or even the near Neolithic period. So if you look at, as an example, the creation myths of Japan, which we went over the creation myth in our first episode in Japan, talking about the Neolithic period. You kind of get a sense for how subjectivism was already there, or at least forms of subjectivism. It was kind of already embedded into that collective Japanese consciousness. So in order for me to explain that, I kind of have to re-explain the Japanese creation myths, but I'll shorten it up a lot. So you've got
Izanagi and Izanami, right? Huh?
Exactly.
Izanagi and Izanami dips his spear into water And then he creates land.
And that's what happens, right? And then the two of them, Izanagi and Izanami, who are brother and sister apparently, they go down to the land and they populate the land. And they have a bunch of, very gross. Actually, the way that they have the children is even more gross. I won't get into it. Listen to the other episode if you want the details.
Just say it. How do they have the children? I forget.
It's weird. Like sometimes it would come out of her vagina, but sometimes it would like fucking sweat out of their body, or like, you know, like random shit like that. You know, that's how these divine babies would pop out. So they have all these offspring. There was two main ones though that they had. It was Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and Susanoo, which is the storm or the sea god. And during this, like in this story, Amaterasu is seen mostly as the main or the good deity, whereas Susanoo is seen kind of like the bad one mostly, but it's not that cut and dry really. Honestly, all of the deities in this stories have both good and bad qualities to them, and the texts never really seek to attribute a specific morality behind their actions. So as an example, Susanoo is a total dick, right? Like for pretty much the entire like creation myths, and kind of like a Loki type character. You know, he's very, very, he's a pain in the ass. But that's how they saw him. That's how the other deities saw him. They didn't really look at him as evil per se. They just thought he was a pain in the ass. And the general rule of thumb about morality in general in these myths is that it's totally circumstantial. Right? Like there was not like these rules that were etched into stone like in Western ideals. It was, you know, it was very like, it depends. You know, like, is this a bad thing or a good thing? The answer for the Japanese during, you know, in these creation stories was always, it depends, right? And this rings true even in present day Japanese culture, but specifically during that period that we're talking about during the Meiji Restoration, you know. All of this, by the way, was recorded in a book called the Kojiki, or the Record of Ancient Things. It was written in 712. And also the Nihongi, which is the Chronicles of Japan. That was in 720. And these were written at the time as a way for the emperor at the time was Temu, to legitimize himself as the ruler, and also to legitimize himself as divine.
So what you're saying, this story that about the spear and, you know, the population was made up?
Yes, I'm saying it was made up. It's not real.
Oh, that's disappointing.
Sorry.
I thought that was real.
No, sorry.
In reality, they were ruled by, it was the Jomon people.
In reality, it was aliens. Let's be real.
Trebek, what is Jomon?
No, but so Temu, that the emperor at the time, he used this creation story. Like, they wrote it down. Like, it had been in the national identity for some time, but they wrote it down in a way to legitimize his rule. Right? He said he was descended from Amaterasu, who was descended of Izanagi and Izanami, who were the creation gods. Right? Actually, all of Japanese people in some way can trace their lineage to the gods, but specifically the emperor was special. And that's not new or anything like that. Like, we see this trope all the fucking time with, you know, plenty of emperors and kings and monarchs, and, you know, just pick one. They probably have, you know, some claim to being a god or descended from a god.
That's the justification for monarchy, is that you're ruling on behalf of God. Like, that's the justification of having a king in Europe, because you are literally ruling on behalf of God. You have been chosen by God to rule. So you need that religious justification to legitimize someone's right to rule through hereditary gains.
And this isn't an ancient thing, just like exclusively. Like, we see this still right now.
I mean, what do you think justifies the kingdom of Saudi Arabia? Like, what do you think justifies? What do you think justifies these? Yeah, because the House of Saud has their stewards for Islam. At least, you know, that's what they would say, because they are protectorates of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina.
Or North Korea, right? So, you know, Kim Jong-un.
I mean, he's basically a king.
he's basically God King, right? And they don't poop, right? I heard that's the thing that they don't do. But I mean, it's even the U.S., right? Like
it comes out their nose when they sneeze.
It's even the U.S. though. Like you can see, like people who say that, I don't think I've heard anyone say that Biden is sent by God, but I've definitely heard that people have said that Trump was sent by God.
That's more of a
that
conservative
Obama
thing.
Was sent by God, and things like that. So but this trope is common, right? I was about to say normal. I don't know if it's necessarily normal. It's definitely common.
No, I think it's normal to. I mean, I think it's not normal like in the modern context for most Americans, but it's been pretty normal to be like, thank God, God has given us
some leader,
FDR, or God has given us JFK, or God has given us, whoever, fill in the blank of who you, what your political affiliation is. But now, there's more, I would say the right wing of America is definitely more religious than the left wing, at least in terms of Christianity.
They try to use a divine inspiration as their means to an end, right? Like, so subjectivism, so they can use, it doesn't matter who it is, right? You could use Trump because he's the most recent conservative leader, in the United States. However, anything he does good is positive because he's got this divine right. Anything that he's done negative doesn't matter because he's got the mandate of heaven, so to speak, right? But this again isn't exclusive to the United States and isn't exclusive anywhere. And kind of bringing it back to Japan, because I think we're getting off track a little bit. This is what they were using, right? And the subjectivism was there, right? There's a divine emperor, right? And the reasons why we do these things is because of this like divineness. And it kind of leads me to an interesting connection between this kind of like supernatural folk tale and legitimizing stuff in Japan. Do you are you familiar with onis? I think we talked about it a little while ago.
I'm vaguely familiar with onis. They're like demons, right? They're Japanese demons.
Yeah, they're like ogre demons. And bringing back up
bring back the Perry thing, the portrait of Matthew Perry. So if you look at the portrait of Matthew Perry, it looks like it really does look like an anti-Semitic poster from Nazi Germany.
Now Google the word oni. Google the word oni, and bring up a picture of him of them. Yeah, it's same thing, right? They are depicting Matthew Perry as an oni, and that's important. Remember that for in a moment here. But I want to tell you a story that was actually super popular during the Meiji Restoration period, and it was story of Momotaro and the Oni. And I'm going to posit, and this isn't my theory, like a lot of people have written about this, but I'd like to make the connection that this story, this folklore, is an allegory for the use of moral subjectivism in building the Japanese empire. So an interesting book that I've been reading, I haven't gotten through it all yet, but it's called Japanese Demon Lore, Oni from Ancient Times to the Present. It's fucking fascinating. And in the 6th chapter, they talk a little bit about the Oni and the Japanese identity. To sum up the chapter, by the way, this is by Noriko T. Reader, is the author. Let's give her her or him, I'm not sure, some credit. So how it sums up is that the Japanese at the time of the beginning of the Meiji Restoration had these kind of unique supernatural beliefs, specifically around the belief of Oni, right? These demon ogre things, right? And during this Meiji Restoration, the transition into the Meiji Restoration, we see, a big westernization. And you would think that it stands to reason that these supernatural belief systems would run counter to Japan's import of all of the, Western culture and political institutions and all the science and military technology that they get, right? I mean, after all, a demon ogre, boogeyman thing wielding a club is not super scary when you've got an armada of ironclad ships and like Gatling guns and shit, that's not scary anymore, But actually what happens is that the supernatural beliefs kind of they get a comeback with the Meiji Restoration, not a suppression, believe it or not. And the reason for this is the reinstatement of the emperor in the seat of power. Right? So like prior, the guy that was holding all the power was the shogunate, right? The Tokugawa shogunate, right?
Yeah, and I guess the shogunate was never justified by any type of like mandate of heaven or anything like that.
No divineness about him.
There was no divineness. Really, the shogunate was just the legal protector of Japan. Like
he was a practical leader, right?
He was a practical leader, but the origins of the shogun and of the Japanese shogun was just because they wanted to create their own legal system for their tax enforcers. If there was a dispute with a samurai or a military clique with someone who didn't give them their harvest of rice or whatever,
right.
If there was some type of dispute, they wanted to have their own legal system to resolve this dispute, rather than have it come from have these disputes settled by some central administrator.
Exactly.
That was kind of like the birth of the shogun, and why
it was a practical application, basically.
And what ends up happening is that the shoguns, they're the military cliques, so they end up being a lot more powerful than this weak state at this time, this weak centralized state that really couldn't do much of anything because it was just riddled with corruption and all that.
It was allowed to exist, but it certainly had a diminished role, right? And so we shifted from, like the supernatural deity that, commands everything, to the practical, like, earthly warrior that commands everything. And now we switch back in the Meiji Restoration, right? In the Meiji Restoration, they kick out the shogun, and they're like, hey, everybody, here's the emperor again, right? And everybody's got to, bow to the emperor again. And so if you recall again, when I said that the emperor comes from the divine lineage of the god Amaterasu, right? So there's the supernatural component coming back in full force, right? So a lot of these belief systems, these oni, like belief in oni, and the use of oni actually has a huge resurgence. And here's an interesting quote. So the Meiji emperor, who was as a manifest deity, was perhaps the most fantastic creature of all in Japan. Became a kind of ideological lightning rod to rechannel, focus, galvanize, and control the outlet of worldly thoughts and sentiments, as well as otherworldly fantasies and desires that coursed through the Japanese bodies. So basically what we're saying is there's a lot of this, kind of otherworldly ideas and belief systems that existed in the Japanese consciousness, but now we have something to focus all that attention and energy towards. And this is especially important because now we're shifting away from, kind of these folk tales, and we're going to science, right? So they needed an outlet for this supernatural, and that became the emperor. And throughout Japanese history in general, like even before this, the word oni has been used as a derogatory term to describe Japan's military enemies. So anyone who was against Japan's military, even if it was even feudal, like battles inter Japan, the enemy was always an oni, right? Abject evil, just bad in general, right? And labeling those who had different customs or lived beyond the reach of the emperor's control as an oni was back in full swing, right? So if you were an outsider, if you were not Japanese or you were against the emperor, then you were an oni. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah. So they would very, very much an us versus them type of mentality.
100%.
And it kind of evolves because at this time, remember, during the Meiji Restoration and during their entrance into the Imperial world, Japan is kind of treated like as a second-class power when they saw themselves as a first-class power, and a lot of deals that they were, like imperial type of deals that they were involved with, as far as like colonies and negotiations, they always felt like they were getting the raw end of the deal, and
they were.
Even though
totally
they earned it, like they would win a war, and then they would still, the big wars that they won. And that kind of solidified the Meiji Restoration and say, hey, these guys are something that you need to pay attention to, are the Russo-Japanese War, and then the first Sino-Japanese War, when they defeat China and they defeat Russia. When these deals to divvy up these colonies that they're essentially fighting for, Japan always felt like they were getting the raw end of that deal, and that kind of plays into a lot of the homegrown nationalism that takes place over the following decades. But Oni sounds like that good derogatory term to dehumanize the people who are persecuting you.
This is where the subjectivism comes in, right? Because now we have a reason, like a good intention as to why we should defeat the Oni. Right? We should defeat them because they're evil. We should defeat the Chinese because they're evil. We should invade Korea because they're evil, et cetera, et cetera. Right? And native Japanese people at this time, they start looking at these different races that are basically forcing their way into their country at this point, as different, right? They're different from them, and it was super good. So jumping ahead a lot, it was common knowledge among the Japanese that during the Second World War that Oni was used to describe all of Japan's enemies at the time. So the Americans, the British, the Russians, the Chinese, etc. Anyone in the Allied forces was an
Which
Oni.
is a very wide coalition.
Yeah, super huge. And literally
a very large, diverse coalition of people, everything from Americans to Chinese.
Right. And it's funny, interesting point, story about this is that even the cartoonists and the caricaturists from this time period in Japan, they were forced to reorganize to suit the government propaganda needs. And there was this magazine called the Monthly Manga, right? This is where the word comes from. That was basically
that's
co-opted.
Where the word manga comes from.
Yeah. It's Shin Nippon Mangaka Kyokai, which is the new association of Japanese cartoonists. They published this monthly quote thing called manga, right? This is where it comes from. And this was at the time the only cartoon magazine that existed during the war, and it was used as a propaganda tool. So the editor at the time, Kondo Hidezo.
Let me add though, U.S. There's something that's really interesting. Look at the old Disney cartoons that were produced during
World War
the
II,
War Department, especially the War Department in Canada. It's really interesting. You can find these all on archive.com. Like they're all archived where you're seeing like crazy fucking derogatory,
very racist, right?
Very racist, like propaganda cartoons with like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and like Disney characters, and just portraying Japanese people as like like the big teeth, glasses,
right, dumb, all that shit, right? Mm-hmm.
It's very, very surreal.
It's cringy,
to watch
dude.
These videos.
Some of it is cringeworthy.
You can look at these videos. They're very, very interesting to watch.
Obviously
on
that point though, it was going on both sides, right?
Yeah, well, it's war. But how do you get people to fucking bayonet someone to death?
Exactly. And
I mean, I don't know how much that was going on, but how do you get someone to fucking flamethrower a group of people in a foxhole?
It's you have to depict them as evil, right? You have to put it in the soldiers, the common people's mind that they are evil. And the one way that they did this in this manga was, one of the editors, Kondo Hidezo, he depicted people like Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin all as these evil Oni demons. Right? He literally drew them as Oni.
Here's a question that's kind of unrelated, but I'm just curious. What is your favorite absurd wartime propaganda poster? Do you have a favorite?
Oh, geez. You can't put me on the spot like that. That's hard.
There's so many good ones.
A number of them from Nazi Germany come up, and it's hard to describe them because I don't know the names of them. That's a fascinating one.
And by the way, we're not saying that we like the propaganda
Right,
and
it's
the
just
racial
like,
imagery. We're just saying
find
they're
them
interested in them
Right.
because they're so like weird and surreal to see
Yeah.
these things. My favorite one is the one that like holds my memory the most is an American one of like Defeat the Gorilla, and it depicts the Imperial the Second Reich, the Imperial German army in World War I as guerrillas. Like that's my favorite one.
I don't think I've seen that one, but
And then
I
Defeat
can
the
imagine
Hun.
it.
There's a lot of Defeat the Hun ones. Because basically the way that they're portrayed in Western media is that these were very fanatical military, like a very fanatic militaristic society.
Yeah.
And that is why
That's why
there
they were
must
guerrillas.
be. That's why you have to sacrifice your sons for this war. Because I mean that's what you're doing with these large scale wars. You're convincing people to give their sons life. Like that's what you have to convince. You can convince people to do that in World War I. You can convince people to do that in World War II. Now it's very hard to convince people to do that. But how do you get people to convince someone to sacrifice your child? And that is, part of that is with extreme levels of propaganda.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I guess kind of bringing this back to Japan.
Sorry
in the
to
same
take
way.
that off route. It's just
What?
sorry to.
Oh, no,
to
that's
go off
fine. I
such
think
a
this is still
tangent.
related. I think the systemic use of war propaganda fueled by this moral subjectivism is what laid the groundwork, for a lot of things that went on. And also, interestingly enough, it also provided the groundwork for the popular art form manga. So, that's a thing.
So you're telling me that Yu-Gi-Oh is the descendant of these like
propaganda.
Japanese.
Yeah, man. It's
You're
the
telling
heart
me
of the
that
cards.
Hello Kitty is Hello Kitty, was that just an anime first or whatever?
I have,
or
dude, I
manga?
have no
Probably,
idea about
right?
Hello Kitty. I have Sanrio Surprise. I don't know. I don't know. That's all I know about Hello Kitty.
Nintendo's origins is a card company.
Yeah, that's true.
Did you
That's-
know that?
That's where they started from. Okay, so I meant to tell an actual folklore story, and I want to, and that was the Momotaro story. So this is a really good example of how oni was used to the idea of this oni, right? Like this derogatory, like make your enemy look like evil, and use that as to justify imperial actions. It comes up in this story, Momotaro, or Momotaro means peach boy, and the kid is named Momotaro because he was born from
Peach
a peach.
Boy. That sounds like something that you would call. It sounds like something a coach would call, like, a kid who's struggling on a football field.
Hey, Peach Boy.
Hey, Peach Boy.
Hey, peach boy.
Come on, Peach Boy.
Well, he was evidently he was born from a peach that was like divinely sent or floated down a stream or something like that. That's his origin story. But he grows up, little peach boy, and he
Peach Boy.
he ain't no
love
bitch
that.
though, because he develops super strength, right? Like he's super strong, like unnaturally strong. And at this time, there were a group of oni, right? These evil ogre demons from a distant island, and they would come over to the capital here, in Japan, and they would loot treasures and abduct people and just overall be dicks, right? And these evil oni from across the river. So Momotaro decides to do something about it. So and this is actually written in there, that the wording is important, to confront them and subjugate the oni. That subjugate part is super important, right? It's not just confront them, it's confront and subjugate them, which is fascinating. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So his parents give him some dumplings so that he has some food to take with him on the trip. And then he meets a dog, a monkey, and a pheasant. And they all become his little buddies, or his vassals, in exchange for his dope-ass home-cooked dumplings. So he gives them some dumplings, and then they work for him now. So Momotaro and his 3 animal friends go to the Oni Island, and they presumably beat up on him, and they take back all of the island treasures with them.
You mean the dog, the monkey, and the pheasant?
And Peach Boy.
Oh, well, and Peach Boy?
Yep. So that's the basics of the story, right? It's a neat little, fairy tale, folk tale, whatever you want to call it. But this was actually one of the 5 most famous folk tales in Japan in the pre-war period. Momotoro Story was adopted in the elementary language texts during the Meiji Restoration period in 1887, to be precise, and it was continuously printed until the end of the Second World War. So they actually used this story as a way to teach kids how to read and write, but also because they wanted to use it as a leverage, or like almost an indoctrination, if you will. This story had a deeper meaning behind it, of course. And so this folktale Momotaro, the original bits of it came up probably around 1500s, right? But it took on like this kind of contemporary, light. And that's why when they were doing the Meiji Restoration, they found this particular story to be useful to them to promote, imperial actions. And I'll explain. So basically, the story started to become that the Oni, are evil, right? So initially, that's what it was, right? So the whole subjugate the Oni part that I was telling you about that was important. The reason why they were doing it initially was because Oni are evil, and that's that. Subjugate evil people, right? But because they started adopting it during the Meiji period, they had to kind of start plugging in the moral gaps to that, right? That's like, even if they are evil, it's kind of fucked up to subjugate them, So Momotaro himself becomes kind of this symbol for a Japanese boy in the Meiji period. And, the educators keep, slamming on that, like he's nice to his parents and like he does good deeds for people and he hands out dumplings and shit like that. Like these are all ideal things that a Japanese kid should do. But also they start putting some nuance around the idea of the Oni, right? So they started to become that the Oni are eliminated not just because they're evil, but because they don't obey the benevolent rule of Imperial Japan. And they do that by, coming to the capital to ransack it. And they do harm to Japan. And therefore, they're taking the people and they're eating them and they're seizing their valuable property. And, they are the most hateful creatures in the world. It's more than just that they're evil. It's that they're against Japan. You know what I mean? And so at the same time that they're printing this in the children's books and pushing this narrative through the story of Momotaro, the Sino-Japanese War is in full swing, and eventually Japan wins and emerges as the this industrial nation in the eyes of the Western powers. But Momotaro himself, this story is kind of the allegory for Japanese imperialism. He is the hero, partly because he is like enterprising and he has like an adventurous spirit. And he's willing to go to all these unknown places to thwart evil, But also he has this kind of imperialistic mindset, right? He's not just going there for no reason, right? He's going there to also steal some booty, take some loot, right? Kind of like when Trump was like, yeah, they should have took the oil, this is,
we're here. Why don't we take the oil?
We might as well just take it, right? Because presumably we can bring it back and it'll be to the benefit of Japan. This was the narrative that was being constructed. So this story of Momotaro and the Oni was used as a way to promote nationalism during the Meiji period, but also later on got totally out of hand during World War II. But that'll be another story probably for another episode. But so. Long story short, because this took a really long time. You're asking about like, was subjectivism introduced, or was it, like already a part of Japanese culture? And it was already there. It was already there.
Well, here's something that you have to consider is that this was a very convenient way to look at things for the Meiji leaders, because they were put in a circumstance where they kind of rose to power, or they got their initial prominence being very anti-foreigner. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
We talked about the picture of Matthew Perry being a monster, Noni. They had to justify their shift in policy from a xenophobic one to a full embrace in Western reform, because at this time they're coming off 200 years of isolation, and that's why, and they're drastically changing and mimicking the best from every other country. So the best from Germany, they're mimicking.
They booted France because Germany beat their asses, and they were like, "Yeah, Germany, you guys are going to help us out now." Yeah, they're taking the best of everything.
So this subjective way of thinking was used to justify resistance to that political reform. Right. So here's somebody that we spoke about, Sago Takamori.
Okay, tell me.
AKA The Last Samurai. One of his big values was the purity of motive. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that they don't really tell you in the movie is that his disciples actually start many of the first hardcore nationalist societies. So Ginyosha and the Amur River Society, things like that. There's like all these really weird secret Japanese societies that start springing up, and in China as well. Like in China and Japan in like the late 1800s, early 20th century, it's like riddled with like these secret organizations.
Nationalist organizations.
Like these very secret nationalist organizations.
Kind of what Steve Bannon wanted to try and do when he set up that did you hear about he set up like a monastery in Italy to try and train populist nationalist leaders.
Really? I didn't hear about that.
You didn't hear about this? Yeah, I was just watching I was actually watching a pretty interesting documentary about QAnon on HBO Max, which is fascinating. But one of the bits about it was that Steve Bannon had went over to Italy and like rented out this whole like Italian monastery to like.
Was that something from QAnon, or was that something from
like spoiler alert,
reality?
Spoiler alert, one of the theories is that, maybe Steve Bannon is Q, right? So they were like going deep diving into Steve Bannon for a bit. But the interesting part was that he was setting up this monastery as like a school for like up and coming populist leaders all over the world, where they can go and learn about how to promote nationalism in their countries and how to start populist uprisings, I guess. I don't know. But that was like a little like pipe dream of his.
To this day, I still have not or ever known anyone who's read QAnon. I wouldn't know what QAnon was if it wasn't mentioned by CNN every second. The only thing I found the QAnon's website. I'm not even sure if that is the QAnon or what, but I don't really. I feel like they're kind of being overhyped. But yeah, for what you're saying, yeah, if Steve Bannon's like creating these or has the intention of making
mimicking what was happening during the early 19th century, which is like all of these nationalist secret societies popping up all over the place. That's what he wants.
So these societies in Japan, one of their MOs is that they were fanatically loyal to the emperor. And what you start seeing is that like political assassinations start becoming just more and more common. The first major political assassination is in the year 1889. So one of these ultra-nationalists, they murder the Japanese education minister for this is the reason why they kill him, for not praising the sun goddess enough.
Yeah, I read about that one actually. That dude is interesting too. Didn't he go to like New York for a really long time, and like he was on one of the missions there, and he studied to like learn how to make, Japan better, and then he comes back with all his knowledge, and then somebody just straight up shanks him because he wasn't worshiping the sun goddess enough.
Yeah, he was a reformer, and he was coming back to work on the Japanese education system based off things that he learned in the United States, and he just
Yeah,
comes back
uniquely,
and gets...
this is one of the dudes that put the story of Momotaro into Japanese like kids' school textbooks.
Well, there's a lot of confliction when it comes to these competing nationalist groups, because this guy was murdered just for the slight of, like, just some stupid slight.
Right.
This guy was probably more of like a someone who was more practical in his approach to statecraft, and was probably more understanding that, you know, they were constructing these narratives for the sole purpose of creating a state, rather than fanatically believing these stories, or fanatically, being a fanatic believer that the emperor was actually a descendant of a god. This is the type of extremism that may come at odds with the more utilitarian approach. You know what I mean?
Right, totally.
So they'll they eventually conflict with each other. You know, the people who are just the users of these myths and fables to create a nation state, and the actual believers. But what ultimately motivated these ultra nationalist groups is that they felt that a lot of these high-ranking government officials, a lot of these businessmen, a lot of them had this weakness towards the West. So just a couple of months after the murder of this education minister, another one of these fanatics tosses a bomb in the foreign minister's carriage, Okama Shigenobu, and he loses his leg. His leg is blown off. And Okuma, I'm mispronouncing his name, Okuma, he admired the assassination attempt on his own life. So I actually wrote the quote down because it's interesting what he says. I don't think he was a madman or a loathsome person. Comparing him with the weakling youngsters of today who worry about bread, sob, and cry abundantly for women, he is truly a wonderful person. I am touched by the bravery, even foolhardiness, of throwing a bomb at myself, the foreign minister, thereby upsetting public opinion. It will not do if young people don't have a vigor that knows no boundaries strong enough to swallow the entire world.
Dude, this sounds like a boomer talking about millennials. Doesn't it? Don't you like,
I respect it. You know, I respect that he came at me. That's basically what he's saying. Like, yeah. I respect that it came at me. I mean, most young people in this generation are just pussies. So the fact that he was willing to come at me like that, I got to respect it. And he, in addition to that, he also makes payments to the family of the assassin, because the guy killed himself afterwards. I didn't know that. Yeah.
That's interesting.
So the point is that not only was there this ultra nationalism that kind of justified their behavior through subjectivism, but there was like a extreme tolerance for the radical behavior. It wasn't like people are like, okay, well, so it shows that kind of the whole something in that society was willing to hear that side out at the very least. You know what I mean?
Yeah. He's literally like okay with domestic terrorist.
Yeah. In the the 1910s and the 1920s, this shishi cult becomes a lot more influential in the military, especially the Japanese Imperial Army. So during this time, the Army and the Navy are kind of at odds with each other. They're kind of ran very independently, the Army and the Navy. The Army being a lot more radical than the Navy. The Navy is more practical. The Army is a lot more radical. Right. We spoke about this in our episode in Myth of the Samurai. There had to be some way to explain victories against Russians and Chinese. And a lot of the military leaders in the Army, what they were doing is that they were putting a really great emphasis on the military spirit. So, how do you explain this? And we were talking. This is a subject that we constantly kind of tackle on this. Is like, how do you answer that question? How did Japan defeat the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War? Right. It's really kind of like a Division I team losing to a Division III team.
Right.
In college
Just
football.
doesn't make
Something
sense.
that doesn't really make any sense.
And then they go on to beat another Division I team. You know, it's like it wasn't like an isolated incident. It's like twice. You know.
So this is where you have the, I guess the other invented concept, or the other kind of great contributor to nationalism is the mythology of Bushido, which basically is a invented ethical system that justified Japanese militarism.
Mm-hmm. There's your subjectivism again. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then so something that's really interesting that that we should probably touch on is that like the big challenge of this is like trying to figure out like what's uniquely Japan and what's borrowed as far as like national consciousness. And it's always a combination of both, going back to nature versus nurture. Like, how much is something that's organic? How much is it something that's kind of exported or imported from another culture? And the Japanese army is heavily, heavily influenced by the Prussian/German army, by the German military. We talked about it for a second, but the guy from The Last Samurai was French. That Tom Cruise played was supposed to be a French guy.
Right.
The French were the guys who were training the Japanese military early on in Meiji Japan, but they lost those rights after they lose the Franco-Japanese War.
Franco-Prussian War.
Franco-Prussian War. Excuse me.
Franco-Japanese War. That'd be an interesting one, right?
Fake history, man. You guys are idiots. You guys are idiots.
All right, but now I have to ask, who do you think would have won in the Franco-Japanese War?
I think that I don't know. I think probably Japan, if it was in the ocean. At that time period, in like 1905, I think if
it was in the ocean, they would have taken it?
I don't know. I think it's a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, their boats were
Japan's
faster.
Navy was Japan's Navy was like the real kind of bona fide X factor. Like they had maybe one of the best navies in the world at that time. They
actually had people they were sending diplomatic missions over to England, and they were building ships initially in England because they were learning how to build ironclads and shit like that from the British. And it got to a point where the ships that were being built by the Japanese in British like shipyards were better than the ships that were being built in those shipyards for the English. Like they were making better ships. Faster, more firepower, like everything was better about them. And then they started making them, on the in the homeland. But yeah, if it was fought, like maybe if it was fought in like a field or something like that, in some neutral territory, like in Europe or something like that, they'd probably get their ass beat. But if it was a Navy battle, Japan would take it.
It's funny because World War II in the Pacific is by far the largest scale naval warfare the world has ever seen and probably will ever see.
Right.
The Pacific theater. Like there's nothing that even comes close to the naval warfare that took place between the United States and the Japanese Navy during World War II. Just because both had, very industrialized, built up navies and just had a bunch of ships. But there was nothing like that in World War I that happened. There was one minor naval battle. Well, it wasn't minor. But there was one naval battle in World War I between Germany and England. And it ended up being like a couple of ships were sunk, but it wasn't like some climactic battle. It was just something that
happened.
It's something like a quick thing. But the point I was trying to make with Germany is that the Japanese adopted the tactical doctrine of operational discretion, which basically gave junior officers the right to make tactical decisions, even against orders. So if a junior officer is put in like a place where they need to make some move on the fly, then they have the right to do that. They have
We're
the
allowed
right
to call an audible,
orders.
basically.
They can make they have some audibles there, and this explains the reason why I think this is adopted is because a lot of the military operations from Japan on mainland China at this time in the 20th century were clandestine. Like they were secret. Like a lot of the stuff they were doing was not supposed to happen, like according to the world. Like the world condemned Japanese movement and military engagements in China. But this kind of highlights the value of being spontaneous, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Which is like one of the values of the shishi. Mm-hmm. But man, so many things to tackle right here on this subject. I want to talk about civilian nationalism a little bit, because by the early 1920s, there was a lot of profiteering that was taking place in Japan. So there were a lot of oligarchs that were created during the kind of boom of Japan. All these new tycoons being created, all these new like different leaders in like the steel industry and a railroad industry and all these different industries in Japan, which created a really large gap in income equality. There was a very large gap between the rich and the poor in Meiji Japan. And the reaction to this new generation was a kind of hatred of like this privileged class. So the privileged class was like the old feudal cliques and like corrupt politicians and business elites who were essentially looting the country. And you actually see pamphlets at this time that are calling for the straight up murder of people in the privileged class. Like people fucking get their panties twisted over some bunch of
Bernie
fucking
Sanders
idiots,
tax the rich.
a bunch of fucking idiots walking into the Capitol. This is not a very messed up society is the one that we're talking about right now, where there's straight up like calls to action of violence, of go kill this political figure and just do it. Like this is not what we have in America right now. As much as you think the political climate is heated up, it's not to the point where people are hurting each other on a mass scale. Yeah, there's isolated events that are bad and tragic, obviously, but we're not seeing like calls to action to murder people.
Not widespread ones, at least.
At least not widespread ones. Like
and
ones that are
when people try to go to assassinate people in our country, we frown upon that. Not not like say,
that's
hey,
something
well,
that we don't usually condone.
In
the United States,
we're not cool with that. Not like in Meiji Japan, where dude's like, oh yeah, he blew off my leg.
Where if you try to assassinate someone and fail, the guy's gonna be like, you know what, I like that. I like this guy. He has some balls. You can marry my daughter.
I'll pay your family for the rest of their lives.
So on April 1920, I have this written down, an army officer named Asahi Haigo responded to one of these calls, and he killed the business magnate Yasudo Zenjiro. And he committed suicide afterwards, but he left back a manifesto denouncing this privileged class and calling for a new restoration. And I want to read this out because it's fascinating. I gotta turn the phone off real quick. All right. My fellow young shishi, your mission is to bring about a Taisho restoration. Do not speak, a Taisho restoration. Do not speak, do not get excited, and do not be conspicuous. You must be quiet and simply stab, stick, cut, and shoot. There is no need to meet or to organize. Just sacrifice your life and work out your own way of doing this. In this way, you will prepare the way for the revolution. The flames will start here and there, and our fellow idealists will band together instantly. So forget about self-interest and do not think about your own name or fame. Just die, just sleep. Never seek wisdom, but take the road of ignorance and come to know the height of great folly.
Just straight kill yourself. That's what he's saying.
Just don't even think. Just act out of pure compulsive malevolence. That's basically what the manifesto says. Like, it's time to just say fuck it.
Just kill.
Just fuck it. And there's a series.
That's kind of hard to read, to be honest. You know, like because it's so far removed from us, it's one thing. You know, so you can read it, but like trying to put that into a modern context, how utterly ugly that just feels. You know,
it's just pure.
It's heinous.
Yeah, it's just pure. Like, what? We see some fucked up shit in this country, but it's like isolated. You know, it's like you don't really come across it that much if you're not looking for it.
I mean, just the fact that this is as loudly like malevolent as it is, you know. And this happened 100 years ago?
Yeah, about 100 years ago. So you have to think, like, what are making these conditions? Like, what are the conditions on the ground that are creating such a violent society, you know? Like,
yeah.
What is creating this? And it's, again, a combination of, like, all these different factors of nature and nurture and just different things that are happening in the country as far as, like, you know, natural disasters, for example, are a big contributor.
Right.
So Japan is a place that has very hardcore natural disasters all the time. It's probably the most, it's that region of the world where, you know, the islands like Indonesia, Japan, these islands in the Pacific are the most prone place to natural disasters in the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking about places that have volcanic eruptions that destroy islands completely. Right. Like,
tsunamis,
it's fucking violent geography.
Right.
This is the only way to explain it. Like, the geography of Japan is violent.
Mm-hmm.
It is harsh. There are earthquakes all the time. There's awful storms.
Typhoons.
There are typhoons. It's just like that has to play a huge part in shaping this society. Like, just the geography alone of having that kind of
land is trying to kill you. You gotta be like
the land is actively trying to kill the society. It's like The Happening, in real life, where there, like, every couple of decades there's this reaction from the actual earth, to remove society, remove humans. But this in 1923, there is a huge earthquake in Japan that kills 100,000 people. The Great Kanto earthquake. Can you hear me still?
Yeah.
Okay. I heard a weird sound on my mic. What made this so deadly is that it happened during lunchtime. So
everybody was
it caused all the stoves to catch fire and yeah. So people were cooking and this earthquake happens, and then these turns into like these huge firestorms. And then after this earthquake, widespread violence breaks out in Japan. For example, there's something known as like can't forget what it's called, like Kanto Massacre or like Korean Massacre of Kanto, but in the Kanto, Korean people were just being executed. There was hardcore ethnic fighting or racial fighting.
Pogrom, or like a Kristallnacht for the Koreans in Japan.
Yeah, basically, 6,000 Koreans were murdered in Japan in like the weeks that were following this earthquake. Now, one of the institutions that was just capable of offering disaster relief was the Imperial military. So that's why there was one of the reasons why there was like such high esteem for the military class in the 1920s and 30s, because they were providing a lot of the relief during this period. Because the 1920s in Japan is just like fucking real crazy, man. Like, just financial disasters and earthquakes and all these different assassinations, like just complete turmoil. both Japan and China are both kind of going through these similar type political upheavals. But in Japan, it's like more consolidated together because they actually kind of have this nation state at the time. China doesn't really have the nation state yet. They're still trying to unify because it's such a huge piece of land. But there is, I can read out some of the following assassinations that take place that kind of shape this. I could just read it. I copied from this. I have this essay from Danny Obrick, which I quoted before. I'm just going to read it out real quick because we're at about an hour and a half right now. In the years 1930 and 1933, there were 3 high-profile assassination incidents in Japan. Prime Minister Hamaguchi, the Ketsumuden incident, and then the May 15th incident. So on November 14th, 1930, a civilian named Sugoya Tomeo shot and badly injured Prime Minister Osachi. 9 months later, in August 1931, Hamaguchi died as a result of medical complications. Sugoya targeted Hamaguchi because he had signed the London Naval Treaty in face of the Imperial Navy's objections, thus violating prerogative of armed services to advise the emperor in matters of national security. So it goes to that. It relates to that doing business with the Oni type thing. You know what I mean? Like capitulating to the West. Mm-hmm. Capitulating to, further selling out your country. In February and March 1932, 3 other spectacular assassinations followed. Members of the Blood Pledge Society.
Ketsumeidan.
The Blood Pledge Society. What do you think they're up to? Do you think they just donate blood to people?
Yeah, they're just disaster relief,
It's
do you have positive blood? We need it now.
It's like when people try to justify the rebels up in Idlib in Syria. They're like, what do you think the army... They're called the Army of Conquest. What do you think they're up to? They're called the Army of Conquest. The Blood Pledge Society, which was a radical right-wing organization, murdered former finance minister Inu. Can you read that? Junosuke?
I got you. Inoue Junosuke.
And the business magnate Dan Takuma. Dan Takuma? That sounds lame.
It's a name.
Dan Takuma.
It's got a lame name, but it's he's Dan.
That was a part of a larger plan to kill 20 leading figures in the realms of business and politics. So this was a botched assassination to take out an entire class of elite people in society. So imagine if there was a plot in the U.S. to kill not
Bezos
only
and
Bezos and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and all these
Tim Apple.
Yeah. And then maybe some politicians to go with it.
Yeah, right.
Finally, on May 15th of the same year, naval officers with civilian and army accomplices shot Prime Minister Unake Tsuyoshi, right?
No. Inukai Tsuyoshi is how you'd pronounce that.
Expecting me to be able to pronounce any of these names correctly is something that is not a reasonable request. Many media outlets were sympathetic to the motives of the perpetrators, who openly presented themselves as shishi and published their statements almost without alteration. The presiding judge in the naval tribunal wanted to avoid the fate of Sakamuki and therefore decided to permit defendants to speak at length about their motives. So basically, he just goes on about how the courts were very, very sympathetic to these, and the Japanese public were very sympathetic to their motives for killing these people. And this article...
Hold on. You have to read that one bit there because it's super important, or at least it's crazy. It says, when the perpetrators were arrested, the chief of military police ordered that they be treated as patriots.
Yeah.
Patriots! What the fuck, man? This is crazy.
All right. So, like, let's kind of cap this off with, like... Yeah... I don't know. How do you want to cap this off? I'm trying to think because I feel like we dived into so much, and what I've learned with this pursuit of doing this series on, you know, the rise of the Japanese nation state and all this, and trying to tie things together, is that I knew this was going to be something too big to chew, but I wanted to attempt doing this anyway, you know, just for practice of studying societies and just seeing what we can grab from it. And, you know, when you dive into subjects like this, usually it creates a lot more questions than answers. You know what I mean?
And it's complicated, right? So actually, I have a great way to end this, and it's another fairy tale, another folk fairy tale about Oni. And I think this is a great one to tell because it kind of spins the idea of Onis being evil on its head. And it came out around the same time as the Meiji Restoration as well. So it basically just throws a wrench into everything we've been talking about, kind of. But that's kind of the point, right? The point is that it's super nuanced, it's super complicated. We're probably never going to come up with the correct answer, especially you and I. We're just fucking guys. Like, we're not experts on anything. All right, so I'm going to tell you the story of the Red Oni Who Cried. Okay, so it goes something like, a long time ago, you know, there was, you know, two Oni, and one was called Aka Oni. He was a red ogre, and the other one was called Ao Oni, a blue ogre. By the way, those are the names for the colors, red and blue. The red ogre liked human children very much, and not in like a creepy, like fucking pedophile.
Sounds creepy. It sounds creepy the way you say it.
I'm just
now that we already talked about Q, like everything sounds.
No, I'm just reading the story. He liked kids, okay? And he wanted to make friends with them, and not in a creepy pedophile way, I promise. So the Red Ogre, you know, he wanted to, you know, make friends with them, with the village children, and, you know, he invited the children to come play in his house. Okay, this is actually starting to
This is sounding really bad.
Okay.
It gets worse every single thing that you say.
Okay, so he invites them over to come play at his house, which is admittedly really creepy. But nobody showed up, right? Boo-hoo. And the Red Ogre was really confused about it. He was sad and he was angry.
Kids, come play with me.
Well, I mean, he asked himself out loud. He said, "I'm such a kind ogre. Nobody wants to visit me." So he was like an incel ogre.
I'm just a little ogre. Why don't these kids want to play with me?
Yeah,
sounds like the story of Michael Jackson.
All right, maybe. All right, so the ogre, Red Ogre, nobody comes to his party, right? And he's sad. But the Blue Ogre, who is the Red Ogre's friend, he was pretty moved by this, and he's like, "All right, look, I got a plan." And so the Blue Ogre's plan was for him to go to the village and go like terrorize the children, like go scare them and shit, and then have the Red Ogre like swoop in and like chase him off and like act like the hero, right? And basically like, rescue them from him. And so they did the plan, and the plan went off without a hitch, and the Red Ogre became the most popular creature among all of the children, and they all came to play with him afterwards, right? Because they were like, yeah, Red Ogre, he saved us from the creepy fucking Blue Ogre, right? So after a super nice day of, quote, enjoying the children's company, again, I promise this isn't a pedophile thing, it's just weird. So the Red Ogre finds a letter from the Blue Ogre, and the letter said, "My dear Red Ogre, if people find out that you are a friend of the big bad Blue Ogre, they will not let the children come to you anymore. So I'm leaving. Please live happily with the children. Goodbye, Blue Ogre." And this made the Red Ogre very sad, and the Red Ogre cried out, "Blue Ogre is gone. A dear friend of mine, he is gone." And he cried. and the red ogre and the blue ogre never saw each other again. So it's an interesting story. It's especially interesting after talking about the Momotaro story, where the ogres are distinctly evil and wrong and whatever. And when I was reading this book that I drew from this, it was kind of talking about how this particular story was written in such a way to help people have more empathy and compassion for others, because during this time in the Meiji Restoration, a lot of like normal people, like you said, there was a lot of income inequality, there was a lot of disparity of wealth and of class, and they were trying to establish some kind of, there's a lot of existential questions that were going on around the general populace. So the writer of this particular story decided to spin the idea of Oni as evil on its head. And the weird part about this is that, Japan kind of tacitly understood that from the enemy point of view that they were the Oni, right? So from the Korean point of view, Japan knew that the Koreans probably thought they were the Oni, Same thing with China. And it's kind of like that one fight scene at the end of the third prequel of Star Wars, where Anakin and Obi-Wan are fighting each other, and
I have the high ground.
Yeah, that scene. So Obi-Wan was like, you were supposed to, I'm butchering it. You were supposed to join the Force, not destroy it or whatever. And he's like, from my point of view, the Jedi are evil, So like, it was this.
From my point of view, the Jedi are evil.
Right. It was like this. So in Japan, it was this.
I have the high ground. Stop, Anakin. I have the high ground.
Don't do it, Anakin.
You're supposed to be the chosen one.
I guess what I'm trying to point out is that Japan kind of knew that they were the baddies a little bit, right? And so in a way, the Oni as being evil are kind of like, that's also pretty subjective as well, right? And so in the story that I just read, the Oni are good, both of them are good, and one is just bad as a tool to unite the red one with the children, right? So he wasn't bad per se, but he was bad, right? He terrorized some children so that the red ogre can be the hero. And so I don't know if I'm reading too deeply into this, but like, maybe what if the blue Oni, right, the one that did the terrorizing, is the West, right? And the red Oni is the Japanese Empire, and all the children are the Japanese people, right? And so the West becomes, or the other becomes, the scapegoat, right? They're the Oni, they're the bad ones, but also they're a tool because they're able to get people to unite around the emperor or the red Oni. And specifically it was the West, because of the West that the empire was able to consolidate power in that way. So I might be reading too into this, and I'm kind of formulating the theory as we speak right now, but I find it to be a really fascinating and also interesting allegory for how nuanced this whole situation is.
No, I think that's a very interesting point. I think that I was actually thinking about this earlier today, about how different the political climate was like right after 9/11. Like I was just like kind of thinking about 9/11 and like what New York was like right after 9/11.
Right.
And there was this real sense of unity. Like it was really strange. I'm trying to think. I was really young, but I just remember like this really intense sense of like fraternity and like unity and like everyone was just so nice to each other and like and
it was the birth of the USA chant.
Every single house had an American flag.
Right.
And I was just like, wow, like things are so different. But ultimately the wars that transpired as a result, as a reaction to 9/11, are the reason why I think we're here today in such a weird kind of semi borderline kind of hateful environment. You know, like
Yeah.
it's because I think a lot of the wars, which ultimately, and you know, the financial crisis and all of that, ultimately led to this environment. And it's just really weird circle. And, you know, it is that us versus them type of mentality. Like,
Right.
we're Americans, you know, it's up to us. We're up against this terrible, awful,
We gotta
evil
bring freedom to them.
ideology, and we need revenge. I don't think anyone in the United States, I think it's very, very few people who were supporting the war in Iraq, which was, you know, most people, myself included at the time, even though I was young. I mean, I was in 7th grade, so I wasn't really up to speed on political topics like that.
You're just down to see some tanks.
You know, but it sounded good. But I was in high school or freshman in high school when the Iraq War started, and my mentality was just like, I don't give a fuck about giving freedom to these people. I just want revenge for 9/11. Like, all these people are the same. They all did 9/11. I just want revenge. Like, that was, I think, most of the motive for most people. Like, these people are bad. We got to conquer those people because,
Right.
you know.
But that was the narrative that was fed to you. That was the propaganda that was given to you.
That was necessary for the war to take place, because otherwise you'd just be like, "What the fuck are we doing? What are we doing there?" But I don't know. Just something I was thinking about earlier today, and
It's complicated, man.
it's
These relationships
extremely
are
complicated.
Yeah.
But yeah, you need this. You need this.
You need the boogeyman. You need the
You
blue
need
ogre.
this kind of enemy to create this euphoric type of unity.
It's unity. Mm-hmm.
And that's all. I mean, that's what I'll respond to saying. But I don't know. You have anything else before we wrap this thing up?
No, man. Let's leave it there.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening to another episode of Bro History. Really do appreciate your time. Make sure that you rate and review the podcast. That is the number one way to help us grow. If you want to support our show, you can join us on our Patreon as well. For just $1 a month, you will have access to our Slack account, and we have some bonus episodes as well. So we have another bonus episode on The Last Samurai. So we dive deeper into the inaccuracies and accuracies of the Tom Cruise film, The Last Samurai. And then we also have a bonus episode about Chinese influence on Japan. So if you want the complete series on this, join our Patreon. Also, Slack access, fun way to communicate with us. But other than that, rate and review the show, share, tell a friend. If everyone just told their friend or buddy or girlfriend or wife or husband or whatever to listen to the show, we would double our audience immediately.
Yep.
And then think about that. If they did that, you know, then we would quadruple.
Right. It's like a multi-level marketing scheme.
Yeah.
Except we're not giving you anything for it, except for dope content.
All right. Anything else to add?
No, that's
all right. Well, this is Saturday, on the 10th, I think. May confused date, so it should be out tomorrow on Sunday. Hope you guys have a wonderful start to your week, and we will be back next week.
Peace.
Peace.